This is not necessarily an episode I wanted to do because you may have heard there was another tragic school shooting in Georgia. Every time these happen, it's terrible, obviously, right? From what we know at this point, it's a 14-year-old who took his dad's rifle to school and killed 2 kids and 2 teachers and injured 9 others. He surrendered to police, which I prefer over the normal, death by cop or suicide that happens at the end of these. But immediately after events like this, of course, everyone retreats to their sides, and we're sort of inundated with people that are demanding that we do something about gun violence in this country. And this is where my controversy comes in, is I think they're wrong because we shouldn't do something. I think we should do something that would work. So I want to be totally clear. I'm not trying to diminish the tragedy of this shooting or any of them. But a lot of the rhetoric that's thrown out after a tragedy like this is misleading. It's misguided. It's often taking advantage of the obvious emotions of citizens, as we should be emotional if this kind of thing happens. But I, want to be clear. I don't think that gun control advocates have bad intentions. I also don't think people that are pro-Second Amendment have bad intentions. So I want to take this episode, take like an hour, and talk about gun violence in America, specifically with school shootings as solutions, just because that's the thing that was in the news. So I want to do it in a way that doesn't vilify or question the motives of either side, and we'll assume that gun control advocates haven't arrived at that position with the goal of confiscation and tyranny, and gun rights advocates similarly don't care more about guns than people, as they're often accused of. Okay, so I'll lay out facts and data, which I know is cold, and no one wants to hear facts and data when they're in the emotional throes of something like this that's tragic, where kids have died, right? But the data does matter if we're going to solve this problem. So that's why I'm going to talk about it. So I'll tell you why I don't think most of the proposed solutions would work that we're talking about. And I want to finish with the policies that I think might actually help and that we could actually do, and I think are very reasonable. All right, let's do it. Welcome to The Homeless Conservative, a show about principled politics for exhausted citizens. I'm your host, Blake Fisher. Thank you for joining me, taking some of your valuable time to hang out. So I want to be clear, again, I'm not trying to diminish the tragedy of this shooting. I know no one wants to hear logic or data when we're dealing with something like kids dying at school where they should be totally safe. And the truth is they are normally very, very safe. Basically, the safest place a kid can be in this country is at school. But like I said, there's a lot of misleading stuff. There's a lot of misguided stuff. I feel like after every one of these mass shootings or active shooter incidents, what everyone does, if they're very partisan and they've got a team they're fighting for, is they look at the details and they try to figure out, does this fit the narrative that I'm trying to push? And if it does, they talk about it. And if it doesn't, they just don't. And this is on both sides. People on the right do this. They try to look for what kind of weapon it was, and as if that proves something. On the left, they do this as well. It's like they're immediately looking for an AR style weapon. They're immediately looking for, where can we blame the NRA for this? Where can we blame conservative media for this? And the right does the same thing. The Nashville shooting, I think that was last year, is a great example of this. It got so cherry picked on what kind of information was used, because the right went all in on, oh, well, look, it was someone transgender, therefore all transgender people are dangerous, which I think is a ridiculous notion. On the left, they just kind of left that part out conveniently, that this person was, obviously jumping onto some cultural things. I think it was not a coincidence in Nashville that you had a shooter that wanted to do a mass shooting and was influenced by the media constantly talking about mass shootings. I think they were also influenced by the constant talk of transgender politics in the United States right now. And I think that, when you're predisposed to a mental illness, you are more likely to soak in some of that culture stuff. But no one wanted to talk about that because they just wanted to talk about the details. And some of those details were convenient. So to the right, the thing that they like to talk about in Nashville specifically was, oh, look, this person picked their target because they thought they could kill more people faster because they had less security. And the right, I think, somewhat rightly points out that we need better security at schools. We need to harden our schools better. We need to be able to prevent this. Maybe it's a gun-free zone situation. On the left, it becomes all about the weapon they use, so we should have an AR ban. as if an AR ban would solve this. I don't think it would. So the point is both sides kind of get hyper political about this. I almost hate reading the news because you'll also see a stat over and over again repeated by the media that there have been 400 mass shootings this year in the United States. We're in September, by the way. That's all pointing to one thing called the Gun Violence Archive, which I do not trust as a source because they count any time multiple people are shot as a mass shooting. Whether it's gang violence, a drive-by shooting, domestic dispute, it doesn't matter. They lump it all together, and it's all gun violence, and we do need to try to solve it, but to me, it's not helpful. So, for example, just as an analogy, I had cancer when I was in my 20s, and what I noticed when I had cancer was that everyone assumed that I had to do chemo, or they assumed that radiation and chemo were the same treatment, as if those are the only two cancer treatments. The thing about cancer is that there are, I don't know how many types of cancer. There are a ton of very specific types of cancer, and they all have a different treatment remedy. So my doctor for years, because not only did I have cancer, but I, did a little bit of radiation, and then I have to do quarterly CAT scans for a while, and then it was every half year I was doing a CAT scan, and then it was annually I was doing CAT scans and meeting with my oncologist. And every year he would pull up on his computer my exact type of cancer, which I can't even remember now because it's been like 16 years. But so he would pull up my exact type of cancer and look at what the suggested treatment and follow-up schedule and things like that were, because this changes all the time too, because they're constantly studying cancer. They're looking at these different kinds of cancers. So I had testicular cancer, probably too much information for you to know at this point, but there you have it. And my kind went from 30 years before I have it being something that killed 97% of the people that got it to being something that had 97% cure rate in those 30 years, because we learned so much about it and it really became not a big deal. Most people with testicular cancer are totally fine. They might have to do a little bit of treatment. Basically, you have to ignore it to die from it. Now, that's great. But my point is my doctor was looking every time that I had an appointment at my specific kind of cancer, because it's not just that it's testicular, it's that it's like non-seminoma type B or whatever, and looking at the treatment schedule, because you can't treat one kind of cancer the same as every other kind of cancer, or it will potentially not work. We've got to think about gun violence, which is funny because a lot of people use the analogy of it being an epidemic or a cancer. And in some ways it is, but we can't treat it all the same. We can't look at the 40,000 deaths by guns last year all the same and try to propose one solution that solves all of those problems. It would be like treating every single kind of cancer with the exact same treatment. It would not work, and it will not work, and it does not work. So gun violence is multifaceted. It is not a one size fits all problem or solution. Okay. So first of all, I talked about those deaths. So in 2022, some of the numbers, just so I apologize for all the numbers that are going to be, I'm going to try to throw some of them on the screen. All of these will be in the show notes. So all the links to all the articles and databases that I researched for this. This is one of those things I was actually already working on for a series of YouTube videos. And I've previously written a blog on the gun violence thing. So I already had some of this information. I updated some of it. Most of it is from the year 2022 or 2023. And that's because generally we don't get crime data from the CDC or FBI for a 2-year gap. It's actually like a year and a half. So in October of this year, we'll get 2023 numbers. So that's the reason most of them go back to 2022, and I don't have 2023 numbers because they don't exist yet. So anyway, in 2022, the most recent year we have the data for, there were 48,204 deaths by firearm, which actually peaked in 2021 and then dipped a little bit in 2022. The key thing to know about that is that you will read articles that will say this exact sentence. Last year, or 2022, there were more than 48,000 deaths by firearm, which is true, except that some people like to inflate that number because a gigantic chunk of that, 56% of it, is suicides. And I just don't think it's helpful to talk about suicides the same way we talk about homicides, because they're two completely different things, including that one is not a crime, technically. You're not going to go to jail for trying to kill yourself. but you will if you try to kill another human being. So we don't even treat them the same legally. So why should we treat them the same with legal solutions or policy solutions? It doesn't make a lot of sense, right? So suicides are a huge chunk of it. Now, what I don't like about suicides is that both sides use the suicide data to further their narrative. On the left, on the gun control side, typically, I'm calling it the left, you're going to hear that number all the time. Gun violence. And the tricky thing is that articles on places like Vox will do this fun thing where they will show you one chart, for example, that says, oh, look at the total, or look at the homicide data, and it'll show you that. The next chart, you'll think you're still looking at homicide data, but you're looking at maybe all gun deaths instead of just homicide data. So there's this neat, like, sort of bait and switch where sometimes they use all of the firearm gun deaths, because they want to inflate the number to make it seem scarier, which the truth is, suicide is terrible, but it's not terror-inducing in the sense that it doesn't kill other people, right? So it doesn't get the same kind of headlines. It obviously, again, doesn't have the same type of solutions. But what bothers me about the right is that they just but 2/3 of those, or half of them or whatever, are suicides. And they just and that's the end of the conversation for that. As if we shouldn't be concerned that 26,000 people in 2022 killed themselves with firearms. I think that these are both problems, and we should try to stop as many of them from happening as possible, whether they're suicides or homicides. So I don't like that the left lumps them all in together as if they're all homicides or gun violence or things we should be scared of or ways to implement gun control laws. And on the right, I don't like that we just go, that's suicides. You can't do anything about suicides. I don't believe that you can't do anything about suicides. So in 2022, also, we got a graphic for this if you're watching. So this is specifically homicide data. So in 2022, we had this was kind of weird too, because there's some discrepancies in the numbers that I was looking at. According to the FBI, there were 14,700 deaths by firearms that were homicides. CDC says it's 19, so that's where I'm a little confused about how they're off by 5,000. I don't really, maybe I didn't look at the data right, but we'll call it, 41% of the total deaths by firearm were homicides, okay? 14,000. That's going to include lots of different kind of things too. So we've got mass shootings, you've got gang violence, you've got domestic violence, you've got good old-fashioned just murder, There's all sorts of these things that happen. There's accidents. There are legal interventions where the police either shoot someone or self-defense. There's clearly a situation where your life is in danger. It is a homicide if you draw your gun in self-defense and kill someone, but you might not be charged with it, and it's a legal form of killing someone with a firearm. So even within the homicide data, there's a lot of different stuff. But just looking at the homicide stuff by weapon type is what this chart is. Of those, we've got 19,000 homicides in the year, 14,000 of which were with firearms, okay? So handguns are almost 8,000, 7,937. Firearms that aren't stated in some sort of way, because a lot of times they don't know what kind of weapon was used. We've got 5,706. And then we've got way down the list under knives and other weapons, and under the personal weapons like hands, fists, and feet, you've got rifles, 542 deaths in 2022. So that, keep in mind, all rifles, because the FBI does not differentiate between rifles and AR style rifles. It's just all rifles, long guns, they call them sometimes. And that 542, more people were killed with fists and feet and hands or other weapons, things like maybe baseball bats, things like that, clubs. Actually, clubs is further down. Then all rifles combined, okay? And then shotgun, 186. So we've got lots of different ways that people kill people, and they're all bad. We should try to prevent all of them from happening. One thing I don't like about the right is that they point out, people kill stuff with other stuff too. That's absolutely true. People do kill people with knives. In fact, knives account for 1,600 deaths in 2022. I'm going to accidentally say last year multiple times, but I really do mean 2022. Whereas all rifles, 542. So 3x the number of people were killed by knives in 2022 than all rifles, which is why you're going to get where I'm getting with this, is that an AR ban wouldn't really do much of anything. Okay? So there's a lot of these things that happen, and murder's bad. Homicides are bad. We should try to prevent them. But my point in breaking down these numbers is that we cannot think of it as one giant lump of 48,000 gun deaths, because you have to think of suicides differently. Honestly, I think you have to think of suicides differently by demographic. Suicide is a huge problem, specifically with older white males, aged 40 to 65, essentially. Huge chunk of the firearm deaths by suicide are white men in their, midlife to late life. These are things we should be looking at the demographics. We should see how we could change it. Okay? But let's talk about mass shootings specifically, since that's what we're talking about with the school shooting, because I think that this is the most terrifying kind of thing we see on the news. Whether it involves kids or not, obviously a school shooting is the worst version of a mass shooting. But the mass shootings in general are terrible, whether they're at the mall, at a workplace. It doesn't really matter, because you're just going about your everyday life and someone is indiscriminately shooting at people for solely the goal of killing as many people as possible, often before they kill themselves or wish to be killed by the police. In 2023, and this is, again, we're going to 2023 now because I do have the data on some of this. 2023, we had 48 active shooter incidents, 15 of which met the definition of a mass killing by the FBI's definition. This is where definitions do matter. And so if you are reading articles or watching news, it is important to understand the difference between these things. And there is a lot of arguments about what is the right way to do it. I'm going with the FBI's just because the FBI and the CDC specifically are gathering data about this stuff and then categorizing it. It's not that I think the FBI is the perfect source of information. They have trouble sometimes getting local law enforcement stuff, although that's improved over the last several years. They've changed their methodology on how they get individual crime data. So the reason I'm going with the FBI's is because I think we have to have a way that we talk about this stuff. We have to agree on definitions. So there's a difference between an active shooter incident and a mass killing incident or a mass shooting, what they call. FBI defines a mass shooting as 4 or more people being injured or killed by gunfire, and that could be domestic potentially, if that makes sense. So if someone killed their whole family inside their house, the FBI could still qualify that if it was 4 or more people that were injured, not including the shooter, as a mass shooting. Okay. Active shooter incidents, they categorize differently because they're generally in public places. They're generally completely indiscriminate in the sense that someone is just taking a gun to a popular area and shooting at people. It might be a school, it might be a park, it might be a mall, could be a movie theater, but the goal is just to kill people. Okay. They don't know the victims a lot of times. They're not purposely targeting them. This is why workplace violence is sometimes a tricky part of that, because sometimes the workplace violence is someone comes in and shoots their boss. Sometimes it's that they just go to work and shoot randomly. Now, generally there's a relationship there, so it can still be an active shooter incident for that, but the motivations do matter in these situations. So there were 48 active shooter incidents. Gun Violence Archive and CNN and every media outlet you're going to see them constantly. They're going to say, according to the Gun Violence Archive, there have been 380 something mass shootings this year. I don't like that number, again, because it doesn't actually drill down into what's actually going on. And so it doesn't help us. I like the definition of, okay, what is an active shooter incident? Because that's a specific kind of violence that if we're trying to prevent, we need to know how they happen, what the motivation is, who are the perpetrators of this, okay? I think that matters. So in 2023, we had 244 casualties from those active shooter incidents. And as far as weapons used, it was 43 handguns, 16 rifles, and 1 shotgun. 48 out of the 49, because there was one that had 2 shooters, were male. So overwhelmingly, this is a male problem, okay? Often a young male problem, okay? As far as mass shootings go, there is some discrepancies here. I'm not trying to pick the lowest number. I'm not trying to pick the highest number. I'm trying to find what has the best definition. The problem is that the FBI changed their definition of mass shootings in the 90s because of Columbine and some things like that, and active shooter incidents. So some of this is new terminology that we're trying to look back and recategorize stuff as. But I'm going to go, look, Mother Jones is a very left-wing media outlet, no doubt. But their definition, by looking at the data, and they have some good explainers, I've got it in the show notes, of why they count it the way they do. I think theirs is pretty fair. And they say that there have been 152 mass shootings in the U.S. since 1982, compared to the 300-something that Gun Violence Archive will tell you happened just in this year, 2024. So these are rare. We see them on the news, though, because they're obviously very emotional, especially when they're school shootings. They're terrorizing, and they make good news. And people are empathetic to it, and it's very sad, and I agree with all of that. But we do tend to see the bad news. The classic example is you don't hear about, thousands and thousands of planes took off and landed safely today. You just hear about plane crashes. So this isn't like the media is doing a bad thing necessarily. They're covering news. These are newsworthy events. We should cover them. We'll get to why I think they cover them, in ways that encourage shooters in a little bit, but I just think that this is something that accounts for less than 1% of annual homicides. You are much more likely to die in so many other ways, even by gun violence. So annual homicides, less than 1% are in any kind of active shooter incident or mass shooting. As far as the breakdown of the types of weapons over the last 20 years, so FBI had a 2019 report. Over the previous 20 years, which would have included Columbine, 63% of the weapons were handguns, 26% used rifles, and 10% used shotguns. That is in specifically active shooter incidents, mass shootings, okay? So overwhelmingly, it's handguns. We do see more coverage of it when it's a rifle. I think that is not an accident. But the deadliest mass shooting was Virginia Tech, which was 2 handguns that the guy had. So you can kill a lot of people with any firearm. That's kind of the point of any semi-automatic firearm, is that you can shoot a lot of ammo in a short amount of time. Doesn't require the big scary rifle. As far as school shootings, this is where it gets really, really tricky, okay? Because some databases talk about using a dispute in the parking lot after a football game, for example, between 2 parents as a school shooting. I do not count that as a school shooting. It's dangerous and shouldn't happen, but that's a totally different problem again to solve than someone going into a school with a weapon to kill students and teachers. It's just not the same thing. At max, I looked at this big chart and I had to, do formulas in Excel, so I haven't had to use Excel in a while. So I did some work for this. Okay. According to my math, there's been 191 active shooter incidents in K through 12 schools since 1980. Again, I'm talking about active shooter. Specifically, I'm looking at the data that says this was sort of indiscriminate, and the FBI would categorize it as, yes, this is an active shooter incident. Okay? Because this spreadsheet had all that stuff. So in those 191, there's been 148 student fatalities and 450 wounded. This is where I'm going to get in trouble. This is not an epidemic. Gun violence is not an epidemic. Any way you look at the numbers, gun violence has gone down. It peaked. It's gone up and down. I mean, we're a violent country. That's a weird thing. We are an outlier in violence of every kind. We have more homicides per capita, whether by guns or other methods. We kill more people with knives. We kill more people with our hands and feet. We kill more people with fire than other countries. We are a violent country for some reason. That's a whole psychological thing we could get into, for sure. But if you look at the data going back, basically gun violence peaked. The last time it peaked was in 1992. It has been declining ever since. We've had little blips. We had a little blip during COVID for sure. But violence and homicides in general are not the epidemic that people are making it out to be. We are much safer than we were 30 years ago when it comes to any kind of violence. And especially at schools. Active shooter incidents have increased over the last couple of years. There has been an uptick, and that's concerning for sure. But I think that we could I think there are some reasons for that. So the reason I don't say this is an epidemic is because if there have been 148 student fatalities since 1980 in school shootings, 450 wounded, which I do think we should talk about the wounded too, because I think getting shot is probably not fun, whether you die or not. Okay, so no kid should have to even be wounded. by gunfire at school. So I do think it's worth talking about those 450 kids that were wounded, okay? But around 100 kids die every year walking to and from school or riding their bike. We don't talk about that like it's an epidemic, and that happens year over year over year, and are also things that I think everyone would want to solve. There's no one is like defending, I don't know, whatever it is, automobile traffic around schools going fast or something. No one's doing that. So your kid is more likely to die on his way to school than at school, whether that's in the car with you or walking. Like I said, 100 kids die every year walking to school, riding their bike. They're much less safe going to and from via whatever kind of transportation they're doing than while they're at school, just statistically, which is why I would love this number to be 0, but it's not zero. But to me, it's not the number that should require active shooter drills, instilling fear in our kids of this thing happening to them, of it being a real thing. I'm in Oklahoma. We do tornado drills for obvious reasons, because in the spring we have tornadoes and they always show up right around the time school's getting out. So that could be a problem. We do tornado drills for that reason. We do fire drills, obviously, across the whole country because a school could catch on fire. We need to make sure we can get everyone outside. Those two kind of drills make sense. But here's what doesn't make any sense to me about doing an active shooter drill. The kid who comes in and shoots up the school always goes to the school and will know those procedures. Obviously, they don't know everything. I just don't think the kids should know any of the procedures. I think that it should be, if we go into a lockdown situation, you listen to your teacher and your teacher will tell you exactly what to do. The teachers could do these drills, but I think it's foolish to think this is kind of security theater. It's making us feel better about it. But the truth is, if there's a kid that goes to the school that knows what the process is, they're going to try to get around it. It's not always that the kid goes to the school that they shoot up. The Nashville one was an example of, they were a previous pupil, but they were an adult. They went back to the school that they used to go to. That does happen sometimes. And even then, they were a previous student. So I don't think we should, these kind of lockdown procedures, I think should be Loctite. I do not think the kids should know everything about them. I don't think you have to do the drills with the kids, because essentially the drill is hide and don't make a sound. That's easy enough to do. We don't really need to practice that. I don't feel like. I know every school is going to be different. But here's really where things, I think, get weird. So I was looking at first I was going to do this episode kind of entirely on gun violence and every different type, and then I realized I needed to focus down. In the process of that, I found, I had referenced in my notes, I had this chart basically showing that violence doesn't, like more guns doesn't equal more violence, and less guns doesn't equal less violence. It's like gun rates of ownership do not correlate at all with gun violence in any way. Sometimes people with very high number, like states or cities or parts of the country that have very high levels of gun ownership have very low. Sometimes they have very high homicide rates or suicide rates. And the opposite happens too. Places where there are no guns have high violence rates or low violence rates. There's no correlation, and he maps all this stuff out. But I found his new blog, and he has a great thing that he points out that I think is worth looking at. So this is his quote, connecting specifically school shootings to suicide risk. So he says, this is, his name's BJ Campbell, and it's got a great blog. I've got it linked in the notes. So when speaking of school shootings specifically, a growing body of research shows that these instances are much more closely linked to suicide than they are to homicide. Over 92% of school shooters were found to be suicidal. Many shooters engage in leakage, which is when they share their plans as a cry for help. Spree shootings are 3.8 times more likely to be premeditated than regular homicides. So that means something like a school shooting, mall shooting, something like that, are planned at almost 4 times more likely than a homicide. Sometimes homicide is just, in the moment, anger or something, boils over and you kill someone and you didn't plan, it wasn't premeditated, okay? But only 1 point time, okay, so going back to that sentence. Spree shootings are 3.8 times more likely to be premeditated than regular homicides, but only 1.2 times more likely to be premeditated than suicides. So again, these are both things that are more often planned, suicides and spree shootings, than homicides. School shooters are more likely to have a history of suicidal ideation than even people who actually die by suicide. Society has broad and deep resources to approach and deal with suicide, but they could be improved, and these resources are the way to approach the root cause of school spree shootings. I think that's right. There's a lot of links there. Like I said, I'll link to his blog. You can then look at all his links with all his data. But to me, that's an interesting thing. A lot of these spree shooters, whether they're in schools or not, are either wanting to kill themselves at the end of it and go out in sort of an infamous way to be something, or they're wanting to do the suicide by cop thing where you show up with a weapon, you fire it, you maybe kill some people. Sometimes they don't even do that. Sometimes they don't even kill anyone. They just threaten to so that they get killed by cops with a weapon. This is a thing that happens. So to me, we've got to start looking at that suicide data. And that's why we should not just look at those 56% of firearm deaths that happened in 2022 as well. They're just suicides. Can't do anything about that. No, because specifically, that is the group of people that sometimes go on shooting sprees. This most recent case in Georgia, the 14-year-old last year, the FBI had looked into him because someone from their IP address was posting stuff on Discord. The username was in Russian, but if you translated it to the letters, it spelled out Lanza, which I don't normally like to say the names of these shooters because I think it gives them the notoriety they desire. But Adam Lanza was the school shooter that shot the elementary kids in where was that? I forget, because there's been too many of these things. So, and he's talking about killing kids at school. They interviewed him. He said it wasn't him. Who knows? This is like we've now had big news, national news events where the FBI had someone on their radar and then they went on to do something violent. And we shouldn't completely blame the FBI in this, but it is a little weird. If you have those kind of threats coming from an IP address where it's like, okay, it's either you or your dad. So it's one of you two, we're posting this. And it obviously, it doesn't take a detective to figure out who's talking about doing a school shooting kind of thing and looking up to school shooters and stuff. It's probably the kid. It's probably the 13-year-old at the time. So this was someone they had on their radar. They didn't have enough evidence apparently to do anything about it. I don't know. That's really tricky. But obviously there are these cries for help almost every time. Las Vegas is the only mass shooting that I can think of that had no manifesto, had no prior violence in their history, no sort of lead up to it, no search history that showed what they were thinking, because normally there's a pattern to this, and we'll talk about that in a little bit because there's a little bit on the solution stuff there. Okay, so let's talk about the solutions to this, because everyone wants to solve this problem. Everyone wants to do something. And what bothers me about that is that people want to do something, whether it works or not, as if intentions matter. Intentions don't matter in this kind of thing. If you want to stop violence, you've got to do something that will actually work. And I'm fine with throwing stuff at the wall to see if it works, but we shouldn't pat ourselves in the back just for like signing a law that says, oh, you can't do this anymore. And then not actually measure it against like, well, does it work? Does it decrease homicides? Does it prevent these sort of spree shootings that happen? So let's talk about the elephant in the room, the Second Amendment. Look, here's the thing. For people that want to take away guns, for people that want to make ARs illegal, for people that want to make handguns illegal, for people that want to confiscate the almost 400 million guns that are in the country, there's more guns than people in this country at this point. We have the Second Amendment, and the Supreme Court has ruled that we have an individual right to own firearms, including handguns, okay? Specifically, because that was what the Heller case was about, was a handgun. There is no way you're going to get rid of handguns. It is impossible. Of course, we have had an AR ban before for 10 years. I think it was 94 to 2004. And, I'm open to talking about that. Like I said, I don't think it'll work, but I don't think it was illegal for Congress to pass that law necessarily. Although I think the Supreme Court now would say they are so popular, because it is the most popular rifle in the country, that they would say it's in common legal use. And so therefore you can't ban something that is commonly used by citizenry in a legal way. So I don't think you could do an AR ban now because they are much more popular than they were 30 years ago. So the point is about me bringing up the Second Amendment is that when people say they want to ban guns or they want to confiscate guns, it's just not realistic. How do you think that would work? How do you think that first of all, what agency is going to go around to the country confiscating the guns from people that don't want to give up their guns? You don't think that there's going to be some serious violence if you tried to do that? I just think that it's kind of the same thing when Trump says he wants to deport 11 million illegal immigrants. It's a big logistical problem that you would have to solve. You can't just wish that away. It's kind of like you can't put that toothpaste back in the tube very easily. Now we can, certainly try to prevent things from happening that make that problem worse, but you can't deport 11 million people easily. It's not very easy. We don't even know where most of these people are, okay? And same thing with the guns. You cannot confiscate 400 million guns. I've talked about this on the show before. Even if you manage to get the levels of guns that Australia got, it's 200 million guns that you got to round up. Doesn't seem possible. Also, the reason I bring up the Second Amendment, when you compare countries to countries, first of all, a lot of those charts and comparisons leave out certain countries because they don't fit the narrative. They want USA to look like the most violent country, but they leave out some other ones. And so it's not, and plus it's just not comparing apples to apples. Again, we are a more violent country than other countries for whatever reason. Like I said, let's get into the psychology of that. There's all sorts of explanations potentially for it, but we're more violent across the board. Also, we have the Second Amendment and other countries don't. So what they can do with gun laws, we can't necessarily, unless you want to get, if you want to repeal the Second Amendment, you got to get 2/3 of Congress and 3/4 of the states to ratify a change to the Constitution. We can't even pass a budget on time in Congress. Everything is split 51-49 right now. You're not going to get 2/3 of Congress to repeal the Second Amendment and 3/4 of the state, half of which are red. That's not going to happen. So that's not a solution, okay? 42% of households have a gun. 66% of Americans either own a gun or are open to owning one, according to Pew Research. So this is also, guns are fairly popular in the United States. I said 42% of households have a gun. Not quite half. And again, there's no correlation. Here's that chart, by the way, from BJ Campbell. This is from a previous blog I did. And so some of this data is actually older because I think I did this in 2016. But this is just showing red states, blue states, high ownership rates are to the right, and high murder rates or homicide rates, are to the up on the chart. And you see there's no real correlation. He's got a line going across. That should be going up if increased gun ownership also increased violence, that line would be going up. There's no way, if you actually look at all the data, that more guns equals more deaths. That's a common misconception. It also, by the way, this chart does not prove that more guns equal less deaths either. He says, I think in the blog, he says, this looks more like someone just took number 8 bird shot and shot it at a piece of paper. There's no correlation between these numbers. So I think that's important to pay attention to. The other thing I hear all the time is mental illness. We always talk about, we got to fix mental illnesses. No doubt we need better mental health care in this country. But what I don't like about this specifically is that we're sort of blaming mental illness all the time for mass shooters when most mass shooters are not necessarily mentally ill. They may have depression. I do not count depression or even major depression that so many people in the country have as the kind of mental illness that requires that, there's clearly a correlation here between violence. Most mental illness is not violent. Most mentally ill people are not violent. Now, when you look at serious mental illnesses, they have been found to be 3 times more likely to be violent, but I'm talking about schizophrenia, bipolar, major depression. So, in that case, I am talking about major depression, but even that, it's 2% of the general population would end up being violent without some sort of exterior thing like drug abuse being involved, versus 7% of people with those serious mental illnesses. So even people with schizophrenia, bipolar, major depression, only 7% of them in studies are found to be violent in any way. So what I don't like about the mental health kind of spin on this is that I think it's just the easy thing to blame. Is let's just blame mental illness, when I think there are a lot of other factors that go into this. For example, if I'm the father of a child that the FBI shows at my door and says might have been posting threats about shooting up a school, I'm getting rid of my guns. They're not going to be accessible to him at all. And that's why the father is being charged with murder. Now, I have not looked into yet the legalities of that. This just came out last night that they arrested him for murder as well. But I mean, I'm not opposed to the fact that he obviously has something to do with this. If your kid is showing the signs of this kind of violence and making these cries for help in some sort of way, and you still let him access your guns and take them to school, I think there might need to be consequences for that. That's controversial. We'll do a whole episode on that at some point because I don't know. There's a personal responsibility thing, but this does come down to parenting a lot of times. You're not paying enough attention if your kid is throwing all these signs out there that they're either suicidal or that they're violent. Like I said, a lot of these perpetrators of these violent crimes, specifically the sprees, had other violent things. One of them, I think it might have been Adam Lanza. One of them was actually like firing at people with a BB gun at one point. It's like, that's violent. We need to take that seriously before it escalates. But my point is that mental illness can't just be the scapegoat for this, because many times they're not mentally ill. And even if they are mentally ill, we need to start looking at that as like, when we see the cries for help, we start trying to help them, especially kids. Okay. There's a couple other solutions that I just want to like quickly knock down that don't work. I've seen people say, if you're on the no-fly list, you shouldn't be able to buy a gun. Look, the no-fly list, there is no due process for it whatsoever. Congressmen have found themselves on it accidentally by their name matching someone that was trying to be in the terrorist database. So that's not, even the ACLU opposes this rule. Okay. So let's not, no fly, no buy, not a thing. Universal background checks is the other thing I hear all the time. First of all, I'd like you to point me to one of these mass shootings that would have been prevented by universal background checks. Almost every time they either buy it legally or in this case, obtain it from their family. So I don't think universal background checks, in fact, the reason I think they hurt is because 80% of gun crimes are committed by non-legal gun owners, meaning they stole the gun or bought it on the black market. So all you're doing is making the people that are already following the rules follow more rules. And the real problem with that is that we already have an overwhelmed system for those background checks. The NICS system is responsible for at least a couple of the shootings because they didn't have current data in it. I don't want to say the NICS system was responsible. The church shooting down in Texas that happened several years ago, he was dishonorably discharged from the Navy for violently attacking his wife. Okay. That was supposed to go from the Navy to the NICS system. They're supposed to report that and say, this person is not allowed to buy a firearm because they've been convicted of a violent crime and they've been dishonorably discharged. The Navy never sent that information to the system. So when he went and tried to buy a gun with a background check, he passed the background check. This system is already being overwhelmed. It's already not up to date. It's already not connected enough to law enforcement. If we flood that system with every gun purchase, that like if I sell a gun to my brother, I have to run him through a background check, that will flood the system, a system that's been overwhelmed more and more every year. In 2020, it saw a record number of new gun owners. So I don't think we should overwhelm that system. It's not that I'm necessarily against the background checks. It's just that I think that system is already way too constrained. And it would I think the other thing that people don't understand about the background check system is that if I go to the store to buy a gun and I run my background check, if it doesn't immediately come back, the NICS system, the federal government has 72 hours to do a response. If they're currently flooded, so December, for example, when people are buying Christmas gifts and some of them are guns, that system gets overloaded. If they don't get an answer in 72 hours, the gun store has to sell you the gun, whether they got a call back on the background check or not. That is to prevent the federal government from slow rolling, by the way, so that they can't say, let's just say you get Kamala Harris in the White House and she tries to make the federal government be slower on doing those things, so that you can't buy a gun in a timely manner. That's what that's preventing. But the problem is that happens sometimes, that they don't get an answer back. The gun store sells it because they are required to. If they don't get an answer back, that's like a yes, they can buy a gun. Should we change that? Maybe. Let's talk about it. But we got to fix the NICS system. But adding universal background checks, people talk about the gun show loophole. It's not really a thing because most people that sell guns at a gun show are federally licensed firearm dealers, which means they are required by law for all purchasers to fill out a background check. So almost everyone that sells guns at a gun show is a firearm dealer and they have to do background checks. So, my brother-in-law bought a gun at a gun show from a gun dealer. He filled out a background check. The only gun show loophole is that if I'm at a gun show and I want to sell a gun as just a private citizen, and there's another citizen that wants to buy that gun, I can sell it to him for cash. But I can also just do that in the Walmart parking lot. I can also do it online. There's all sorts of other places that are more convenient than for me to just go to the state fairgrounds in hopes that I find someone that wants to buy the specific gun I'm selling without setting up a booth and stuff. So it's just not the problem that the left makes it out to be. So I don't think universal background checks help, especially because, like I said, most of the people have passed these background checks because they don't have a previous violent history or any sort of adjudication that would say they're not allowed to purchase guns. Now, I think we should take that stuff more seriously as far as when do we put people into that system. Now, let's talk about the one that everyone's going to talk about, AR-15 bans. As I mentioned, this happened in 94 to 2004. We saw no data that said that it decreased violent crime. And that's because when we go back to those numbers, which graphic was it? I think this is this one. When we go back to those numbers of homicides, all rifles account for 542 deaths. It's like point something percent of the total homicides. It's a tiny fraction. Handguns, knives, hands, fists, other weapons, all of those get used in homicides more than all rifles combined. So doing an AR ban is not going to magically solve the school shooting problem or any mass shooting problem. The reason people use ARs is because they've become a symbol of what's going on. And that's why I want to talk about this New Yorker article that Malcolm Gladwell wrote several years back. So it's a little out of date, but it's really great. Specifically, he talks about how there is a cultural script for these kind of things. They always reference previous attacks. Typically, there are people with a threshold for violence. Like he talks about this in the sense of, in a riot situation, people with a higher threshold for violence may join in because they're influenced by the actions of the people that came before in a riot. And he uses riots as an analogy for things like school shootings and mass shootings. It's just a slow moving riot. And that's why we're seeing an increase happening of more incidents as we cover the incidents and as they look to the violent past of these people. In fact, all the data so far shows that the attempted Trump assassination was probably a school shooter that school's not in session in the summer. Frankly, a presidential candidate came within 50 miles of his house and he thought, well, I could get notoriety that way. It's pretty clear by some of the explosive stuff he had in his car and stuff. He planned on maybe having more victims than just Donald Trump. But everything we're looking at, the data and his search history and stuff like that, indicates that he had some depression problems and wanted to be infamous. We also have this hero worship stuff. Some of these shooters idolize previous attackers. They seek to emulate their actions and gain recognition within the community of those school shooters, because now that you're online, you can find these people that are also like you. They're also always disconnected. They're idiosyncratic. These are always loners that do this kind of stuff. They're certainly influenced by stuff like trauma or exposure to violent media. They've got the same psychopathic traits. Specifically, when you look back at like Columbine is basically ground zero for this, and almost every school shooter for sure has followed them to a T. They do stuff like they video stuff, they write manifestos, they reference previous shooters in their manifestos. So there is a pattern here that we can see, and we need to study it so that we can catch it early. But we're not necessarily doing that. And I think that BJ Campbell has a really good point. We should treat this more like terrorism, because it really is closer to terrorism than general homicide. You think about it. I think the terrorism definition is basically, it's like, violent attacks on people to obviously induce terror or to try to change political stuff. Like that's a terrible, I should have written down the definition of terrorism, but this is more like terrorism. That's the goal of it, is to terrorize people into thinking that they're not safe at school, even if that's not true. So I do think we got to kind of think of this like terrorism, which means we would have to treat it like terrorism, not like just a normal violence. So let's talk about the solutions that could work here. I already mentioned it. We got to fix the NICS system. We've got to improve law enforcement connections to the NICS system, including with the U.S. Navy, apparently, because we've got to get people that shouldn't be allowed to have guns very quickly into the system that says they shouldn't be able to buy a gun. Whether they're a domestic abuser, whether they have a felony of a gun crime, whether they're dishonorably discharged for some sort of reason. Like, we have these reasons that we say it's okay for us to say that person can't own a firearm anymore. We need to get them into that system quicker and make sure that it is accurate and that it is timely getting those answers back to gun dealers so that we don't have situations where we don't get an answer back for 72 hours. That needs to happen quickly. We got to fix that system. That, to me, is priority number one. Just because we need that system to work. If we determine as a society that someone shouldn't be able to own a gun, we need to make sure that we can enforce that. Waiting periods. I'm open to waiting periods, mostly because I think they could help suicidal people if they planned, it depends how much you're planning. If you're in the moment planning a suicide and you don't own a gun and you just go buy a gun, this happens. It unfortunately happened in Oklahoma one time where someone went to a gun range, rented a gun, and killed themselves at the gun range. So this is a situation where, I think that a reasonable 3 to 5 day waiting period could help with suicides, which might help with school shooter stuff. Not necessarily because, again, most of these people are either legally acquiring their weapons or they're doing it over time because they're planning for months sometimes. So I don't necessarily think it's not the end-all solution, but I'm not opposed to it for Second Amendment reasons. I think as long as you had a carve out for people that are potentially victims of other violence. So if you have a woman that is leaving a husband for being violent, I think she should be able to go buy a gun right away, no matter what. I think as long as she passes a background check, get her protection immediately, because it's just not realistic. I'm sorry, when the people are like, you got to call the police. The police are not there fast enough sometimes, unfortunately. People do defend themselves with guns. It happens all the time in this country, and that's something that doesn't get talked about enough, especially because we don't have great data for it. Because just because you said, I have a gun, I'll shoot you, but if nothing happens, people don't typically file a police report in that situation. So I think as long as we had a carve out for people that are generally in violent situations where there's some sort of adjudication where it says they've filed a restraining order or something, we let them get a gun quickly. As long as we have some sort of thing like that, I think I'd be okay with some sort of waiting period. I don't necessarily know if it would help or not, but I'm willing to try it. I don't think it would hurt. I think, like I said, maybe help suicides. And I'm all for helping the tens of thousands of people that are dying by suicides, by guns, okay? I don't want to get into the weeds on gun violent restraining orders or red flag laws, as they're commonly called. I don't think we have enough data on if these work or not. There are states that have red flag laws that have continued to have these kind of shootings, and often it was just that no one reported the person, even though they had all of the telltale signs of that they were going to maybe shoot up a school or their workplace or something. I think it's really hard to take guns away from people that haven't committed a crime. I am open to the idea of doing it when we think people are a danger to themselves or others. I just think we've got to be very, very careful about how we write those laws. And I think we have to make sure that there is some sort of adjudication and that person can get in front of a judge within X amount of hours, call it 72 hours or whatever, to plead their case. Because, people will no doubt falsely accuse people of being violent, just like there are false accusals of rape, false accusals of all sorts of stuff. So we've got to be careful. We got to make sure that people don't get guns taken away without being able to go in front of a judge and explain why they shouldn't. And I think, it should be only for family members, maybe potentially, educators, things like that. It needs to be people very close to the situation that can report these kind of things. With this shooter in Georgia, that was just picked up by the FBI, and the FBI notified local law enforcement, and they together, I think, went and interviewed him. So this was a thing they picked up. They're surveilling for threats like this online because that's where a lot of the threats initiate now. So I'm open to the idea of red flag laws. I don't think that they are the gun confiscation sort of nightmare scenario that the right makes them out to be. And we can tell that's the case because you look at the states that have passed them and they've not enforced them very often. Not a lot of people are coming forward with reasons to take people's guns away. So if Illinois is not taking away people's guns actively, which has the most strict gun control in the country, I just don't think it's very realistic that like, oh, that's just a slippery slope to they're trying to confiscate all the guns. I think that's kind of conspiratorial nonsense. So I'm open to it. I think we should discuss those at least more. But let's look at the states that have already implemented them. Let's see how they work. Let's see if they don't work. Let's see how they need to be improved. Let's, really, I think, like I said, the law needs to be very, very well written. This is not one of those things that any legislature should just throw together and with language that's potentially too broad. I think that could be really dangerous, but I don't think they're unreasonable. There's also, I think mandatory minimums are something we have to talk about. We are not prosecuting existing gun laws very well. Like people want to add these new gun laws, but the truth is we are just not prosecuting existing gun laws very well. And I could get into that. This really deals more with normal homicide stuff. So I don't want to get into the weeds on those numbers, but I do think that we could say if you commit a violent crime with a gun, I think that we should say we're going to take that very seriously and you're definitely going to jail for it. Because as we continue to not take that seriously, it gives permission for people to carry around stolen guns without any sort of repercussions. This is the problem I've covered this with in Washington, D.C. right now. 2023 had a 36% in homicides over the previous year. And at the same time, a decrease in the number of convictions with people that were caught illegally carrying a gun. I think those two things are related. I think as you just slap people on the wrist for carrying a gun illegally, and then you get more homicides, especially when most of the perpetrators of those homicides have been arrested multiple times before. Most people that commit homicide are not, like, it's not their first offense. They've been arrested multiple times for other violent things or gun crimes or things like that. And it might be that might be their fifth arrest for some sort of violent thing is the homicide. This is an escalation problem. We need to enforce the laws we already have, although I don't think that solves the school shooting thing because most of them were not previously violent. I do think we need more research on this. Congress has prevented this from happening. This is mostly Republicans that have done so. I think the data will show what we think it will show. I think that, obviously, because I'm on that side, I am pro Second Amendment. I do not think more guns equal more violence because I've looked at the data and I don't think it does. I think that there are safe ways to use guns and obviously very unsafe ways to do it. And I wish everyone treated it as seriously as I think they should. But when you got the Second Amendment, that makes it a little tricky. But I do think the CDC and government agencies should be able to research gun violence, and they're not really allowed to right now by law. I think that's foolish. I think more data is better and more clarity and more information is always better. I get that they maybe think that it could be manipulated, but it's already being manipulated. When we see in the media, they cite Gun Violence Archive all the time because that's the resource they go to. I'd rather them be able to go to some government agency or some government study or a college study or whatever that says, well, we did this study and it says something else. Okay. So I think more research is good. I also think we need more research and more like mass shooting task forces, which are like local task forces combining with the FBI and Homeland Security and people that actually look into these patterns. And this is a good example of they almost had this. This guy was on their radar a year ago because he was posting threats online. They just couldn't quite prove that it was him. But we can't solve this with government. At that point, like I said, there's got to be some parental stuff. So maybe charging parents with murder that allow their kids who they think might be violent to access their guns and take them to school. In some of these situations, I think the one where the kid went to school, like I said, I don't pay attention to names because I don't like naming these people because it gives them the notoriety they want. But the kid that went to school and shot his teacher and he was like 6. Yeah, his parents, you are bad parents. If your 6-year-old has access to guns, there's no 6-year-old that should have access to guns. Then takes that gun to school and shoots this is a beyond bad parenting, but we can't necessarily legislate that. But if maybe we punish a few parents, maybe people will pay more attention. I don't know. That's a little trickier. Here's where I really have a problem. And this is where things get, maybe this isn't a popular one, but I think this is a decent solution. I've said for a long time, there's a big argument about should we arm teachers? There's a reason that like 98%, I think I've got 98%, this is from a few years ago, so I don't know that this is an up-to-date stat, but the last time I checked the stats, 98.4% of mass shootings occurred in what were considered gun-free zones. That's not a coincidence, I don't think. I think that's because, as we learned in Nashville, They scoped out different places. They picked the place with the least amount of security, and they'd be less likely. I think the other school had an armed guard and this one didn't. And so they thought, well, I'm going to get shot a lot quicker if I go to the place that has an armed guard. We've got to look at gun-free places. And I'm not saying that everyone should be the Wild West. We carry guns everywhere. I'm not saying there can't be laws, but we should at least look into, it's at least interesting that the mall has the you can't carry a gun thing. And so then a law-abiding citizen is going to leave it in their car and not carry a gun because they like to follow the rules. But do you know who does not follow the rules? People that want to kill other people. They know they're going to break the main rule, which is you can't murder people. If they're willing to break that rule, what makes you think they're not going to break the rule that says you can't bring a gun into a gun-free zone? And then they also know every law-abiding citizen's not going to have their gun in that place. So we've got to at least look at that. And specifically when we're talking about schools, because that's what I want to talk about here is just schools specifically. My theory is that all a school district would have to do, if the states and federal government allowed it, I think if the school district, Oklahoma City Public Schools came out tomorrow and said, based on what just happened, what we're going to do is we're going to do this year-long training process. We are going to train teachers, and you're never going to know who they are. You're not going to know which teachers have guns and which ones don't. We're going to train them thoroughly. They're going to take like military level gun classes. They're going to really know how to do it, cleat certified. They're going to go all out, and you are not going to know who's carrying a gun in the school. And we're going to have a sign outside that instead of saying it's a gun-free zone, we're going to say guns aren't allowed here, but we do have staff that carries weapons and are highly trained. My theory is that they could be lying about it all and just put the sign out front, and they might not be a target because who's going to go to that school instead? Right? You're going to pick the place that you're the least likely. So I don't even think you would have to arm teachers. I think you could just, now obviously you can't give up that ruse, but my point is I don't even think you actually have to arm people. You just have to make someone think that they might be armed. I think there's a reason there are fewer mass shootings in Texas, because I think people understand you're not likely to go into anywhere in Texas where someone's not carrying a weapon. Just very high rates of gun ownership. Oklahoma's similar, okay? I think there's a reason that if they happen in those states, they specifically happen at places where those people are not allowed to carry guns. We've got to at least think about doing that. Like I said, you don't even have to arm the teachers. I think you could just say you did. But going back to BJ Campbell, who I'm referencing over and over again, because I found his new blog that's on Substack, and I highly recommend it. He's a great writer, even though he's not a writer, I guess, by career, but he writes some great stuff. But he basically says, you know what we should do is we should spend some money and just put an ex-military guy in front of every high school, like full garb, have the rifle and the sidearm and all the stuff, like full out, sitting in front of the school all the time. I did the math, by the way. Okay, this is how many schools. Most of these happen at high schools. There are 20,000 high schools in the country. There are 11,500 K through 12 combined, where it's like a smaller school, and so it's all in one building. So that is 31, almost 32,000 schools. Because like I said, this doesn't happen very often at elementary schools. It has happened a couple times. Not very often, okay? Doesn't happen very often. So let's just look at just the high school. So that's 31,000 schools, almost 32,000 schools that you have to arm. If you paid an armed guard, ex-military guy, someone that's actually well-trained already, so you don't have to retrain people, you don't have to train teachers. I understand that people are worried about that. I get all that, because some people are good gun owners, some people are good in a moment of crisis, some people aren't. But, if you're ex-military, you've been through that training, you've been qualified. These would be people that are already qualified to do what we're asking them to do, which is just sit there and look intimidating, essentially. But let's just say you paid them $100,000 a year, which would be a heck of a salary for sitting there outside with a gun, right? That'd be pretty good. I think that's probably on the high side of what you'd have to pay him. But even if we paid him $100,000 a year to 31,000 schools, 32,000, that's basically $3 billion. That's not insane. We spend a lot more money on a lot dumber things the federal government does. So I don't think it's a bad idea. If the federal government right now, if Republicans in Congress said, okay, here's what we want to do about it. We want to arm every school, not the teachers. And they did this exact plan and said, we want to find $3 billion a year to do this. I'm not saying $3 billion is nothing. I'm a fiscal conservative. I would like to spend not tons of money on stupid stuff, but I don't think this is stupid. I think it would work. I think if every high school in the country had an ex-military guy outside with his own rifle, I don't think that people are going to go to those schools anymore. I think we could find $3 billion a year to do that with. I think we could cut, heck, Joe Biden's student loan forgiveness scheme originally was going to cost taxpayers $500 billion, or it was $400 to $500 billion. So if we can do that kind of carve out for people that, have master's degrees and okay, so what is the priority? I think it would be smart for Republicans to do this in Congress, to say, all right, here's what we want to do about it. Get on board. Who's going to vote against that? They love spending money in Congress. They especially love the pat on the back of spending money to protect kids in schools. You don't even have to harden the schools necessarily, although I think that's really important work that they've done. I've not seen all the details of the Georgia shooting. Apparently at that school, all the doors lock like 5 minutes after the class starts, like automatically. And so he left to go to the bathroom. I guess he took the rifle on the bus and had it in his locker. We don't know all the details yet. He tried to come back into the room, knocked on the door, and a student saw they had a gun, and they did the right thing and didn't open the door for him. And he went to a different classroom, I guess. I don't know all the details of what happened, but the point is we do need to have lockdown procedures. We do need to secure schools. They should have one entrance. They shouldn't have multiple entrances that people can come in. But on top of that, we need people to know that they're going to be met with force. We need to treat it like terrorism. When I go to New York, I was in New York the week that we invaded Iraq in 2003. The National Guard were everywhere. They were at every subway station. They were posted up. They were making sure that everyone knew that you are not getting away with anything down here if you try it. Sort of the same thing this past spring break. I was in New York and cops were everywhere. Some National Guard, I think, were potentially there too. Just because it's like a high traffic time. They've had some shootings. They've had some crime problems. They're trying to go, look, we are a presence. You are going to be met with force. That's what we've got to treat it like. I know that sounds like a dumb, simple solution, but I'm willing to spend $3 billion a year if that meant that we could reduce school shootings. I would argue they might go to zero. Now, in BJ Campbell's Substack, he actually goes on to say that he would also, if he were the president, go drag the sheriff from Uvalde out onto his lawn and just beat the crap out of him on national television to make an example out of law enforcement. And I think that is a totally valid point in the sense that Uvalde was an example where kids died because of the response, that law enforcement's response was not good enough. And that's when people say, oh, good guys don't need a gun. You just call the police. Well, that's a situation where the police did not do their job well. Nashville, they did it really well. They showed up in force. They killed him. They immediately released the video of it to basically kind of, I don't know, you look like an idiot when you get killed by the police immediately when they come in the building. There's some valid points there. We need better law enforcement. I remember after the Parkland shooting, I happened to be in a thing with Oklahoma City Police at the time. It was like a neighborhood patrol thing. And he just said, look, I just want to be totally clear. If that happens here in Oklahoma City, everyone in basically a call goes out to all law enforcement and everyone would be there. We're running in the building. We're not running away from the building. We are running in the building. That's what our job is. We've signed up for this. He was like, everyone, if Secret Service, Treasury Department, if FBI, anyone that's in the area that gets that call is going to go to the school as quick as possible and take care of it and put their lives in danger for us. So we do need to talk about the local law enforcement thing, and maybe that could be a federal thing. But for the most part, this is a local thing that people need to solve. I don't think the federal government can solve this problem, but they could say, hey, Oklahoma, here's your money for every school to have an armed person out front. You go hire the people. You decide exactly how it works. But that's how I think the federal government can help here, is just give money for the resources to harden schools potentially. And like I said, have armed people. I just think it would help. It's not that complicated. It doesn't require who's gonna get unelected if they vote for that in Congress? I don't think anyone. So look, sort of final thoughts here. I think that solutions need to be clearly based on data. I think that we have to have more data. We've got to look at the cold hard facts of this, even though emotionally this is terrible and we don't want this to happen again. I don't want it to happen again. I would love for there never to be another school shooting. No one wants school shootings. And that's the other thing I don't like about this conversation, is that people on the left accuse people like me or anyone that's pro Second Amendment or anti-gun control laws, or even just saying something like, I don't think an AR ban would work, as being heartless. They accuse us of just offering thoughts and prayers and nothing else. I'm offering solutions. I'm offering information. I think you should do the same thing. I don't think we need to be telling either side or the other that they don't care about kids that are dying in schools. I think that's a ridiculous notion. I don't think it's true. I've never met anyone that doesn't care that kids are dying sometimes in schools. Now, not at the rates that we make it out to be. I don't think it's an epidemic, like I said. That doesn't help in this situation, though, because I just sound like a cold-hearted bastard for saying such a thing. Because it's tragic if even, like I said, 2 kids died. That's absolutely tragic. 2 teachers died in Georgia. That's tragic no matter what. That number should be 0. And I don't think we need to be J.D. Vance either and just say that this is just part of life. I do think violence is part of life in America. We're not going to solve all gun violence. And certain mass shooting events, I think, are also just inevitable. If someone is willing to die in a mass shooting situation, if they don't have a violent history, it's very, very hard to prevent it. That's why I think we've got to look at the suicide stuff. We've got to look at the correlation of those cries for help. We've got to take seriously, and we've got to figure out how to make that into law where we can say, when you post a threat online to shoot up a school, we can take away your weapons. Maybe we can take away your parents' weapons. I don't know. We've got to figure out a way to do that. I'm fine with talking about that. Let's talk about those real solutions, but let's talk about things that will work, and let's see what state laws get passed that work, where we see decreases in this stuff. The other problem in this is that they are so rare, you can't see a straight line. You know, you can't see like, oh, they're going up, they're going down. They're kind of sporadic. They go up, they go down. But I do think the last thing that I think needs to happen is we got to talk about these things different. We can't just go into our tribes. We can't just like go into our team. We can't look at the details of a shooting to figure out whether we're going to talk about it or not. And the media specifically has a very clear job in this. They've gotten a lot better at it. I think that they've got to stop giving these shooters the notoriety they desire. That's the main thing. Looking at that New Yorker article about all the looking back and talking about these people, idolizing the previous people that have shot up schools, we've got to stop that by not, I don't think we should release mugshots. I don't think we should talk about their names. I don't think we should talk about their motivations. I don't think we should publish their manifestos. I don't think we should do that stuff. I'm fine with law enforcement looking into it. I'm fine with even the details being public. But I think the media has a specific responsibility to not talk about it incessantly for 24 hours a day, because it inspires other people like that person. Another loner who's maybe got a psychological problem, or maybe they're just lonely, and maybe they're depressed, and maybe they just want to go out with a bang. But they are influenced by the notoriety that this kid's going to get because his mugshot's everywhere and we're talking about him, and we're, you know, and I think that that's what we should not give people what they want. And that's what they want, is notoriety out of this. We got to stop that. But you can't, we have the First Amendment, so I can't force the media to do it. But like, I'm not going to say people's names ever. I realize I'm just a tiny little, podcaster. But I wish CNN and people do the same thing. A lot of news organizations have started doing this. They might say it once in an article and then say, we're never going to say their name again. We're going to refer to them as the Columbine shooter, or we're going to refer to them as the Parkland shooter, but we're not going to glorify them. We're not going to show you screen grabs of their racist websites, South Carolina shooter. We're not going to do this stuff. I think it would help at the margins. We've done it with suicide risks, and they don't show someone threatening to jump off a bridge for a reason, because it encourages other people to threaten to jump off a bridge and do so. So they've learned this with suicides, but they have not noticed that suicide mass shooter incident correlation is so strong. And they're doing the same thing with mass shooters that they used to do with suicides, and they stopped doing with suicides. They self-regulated and said, here's the way we're going to talk about suicides when it's newsworthy. We're not going to show it on TV. Same reason they don't show streakers at football games that run on the field. Well, not just because they're naked, but even just people that run on the field with clothes. They don't want to encourage the behavior, so they don't ever show it. I think that we need a responsible media that does that, but everyone's got to do it, right? Everyone's got to do it. So that's it for this episode of The Homeless Conservative. Let's talk about this more. Talk about it with your friends. I think that this is something worth having a discussion about, especially when it's dealing with school shootings. No one wants them. So let's talk about it, but let's not vilify the other side. Let's not say that the left just wants to confiscate all our guns and that the right doesn't care about kids dying. That's not true. I don't think that's true in almost any case. And so, sometimes I'm sure it is true, but for the most part, that's not the situation. So let's assume good intentions. I think everyone's intention is that fewer kids die at school. I think that that's fair to say that that's the vast majority of this country's opinion, and that's their intentions. They just have difference of opinions on how to get there. I just have a different opinion. I don't think a lot of the things that are proposed will work. And so therefore, I think they're a waste of time and money. So that's it for me. Thanks for joining me, spending some time with me. I really do appreciate it. One thing you can do that really helps me out, you can rate the show. You can obviously subscribe to it as well. Both those things help. And just tell a friend about it. If you think someone might enjoy the content, send them my way, because that's what this is. It's word of mouth. I am not getting paid by Russia propagandists to make these videos or podcast. We'll talk about that next week, I guess. So I will catch you next time.